Excuse me, but I think there's been some mistake. The voice was smooth, confident, but not aggressive. Marcus Reynolds stood in the narrow aisle of Atlantic Airlines Flight 492. His dark eyes fixed on the blonde woman who had made herself comfortable in seat 3A. His boarding pass, slightly crumpled from the rush through LaGuardia security, clearly showed the same seat number. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Olivia Bennett didn't even look up from her phone initially. Her perfectly manicured fingers continued scrolling through what appeared to be luxury real estate listings, each property worth more than most people's annual salaries. When she finally raised her head, her blue eyes swept over Marcus with the kind of dismissive assessment that came from generations of unearned privilege. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with condescension that came naturally to someone who had never been told no in her life. "I'm sure we can work something out. Perhaps you could find another seat. I've already gotten quite comfortable here." Marcus was tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from 4 days of back-to-back investor meetings in Manhattan, where he'd spent countless hours explaining why Horizon Technologies deserved their money, proving his worth in conference rooms where he was often the only black face at the table. His casual attire, a charcoal hoodie, dark jeans, and limited-edition sneakers that most people wouldn't recognize as costing more than their monthly rent, was a deliberate choice. After years of suits and ties, sometimes a man just wanted to travel in comfort. But comfort, Marcus was learning, was a luxury that came with conditions when you looked like him. "Ma'am," Marcus said, his voice remaining level despite the familiar surge of frustration rising in his chest. "This is seat 3A, according to my boarding pass. This is my assigned seat." Olivia finally turned her full attention to him, and Marcus caught something in her expression that he'd seen countless times before, a mixture of disbelief and barely concealed disdain. It was the look that said people like you don't belong in places like this. "Well, yes, I can see that," she replied, gesturing vaguely at the boarding pass in his hand. "But surely you understand that mistakes happen. I'm an Atlantic Platinum member, and I specifically requested a first-class window seat. I'm sure if you speak to the flight attendant, they can find you something more appropriate." The word appropriate hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus felt the familiar weight of it, the coded language that had followed him through Stanford Business School, through every boardroom negotiation, through every interaction where his presence was questioned simply because of the color of his skin. Behind him, other passengers were beginning to notice the holdup. A few craned their necks to see what was causing the delay, while others pointedly looked away, the universal sign of people who didn't want to get involved in what was clearly becoming an uncomfortable situation. Marcus glanced at his watch, a limited-edition timepiece that had been a gift to himself after Horizon's successful Series B funding round, though it remained hidden beneath his hoodie sleeve. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The gesture wasn't about checking time. It was about maintaining composure. In his backpack was a laptop containing emails that could move millions of dollars with a single keystroke, contracts that employed thousands of people, and strategic plans that could reshape entire industries. But none of that mattered in this moment, because to Olivia Bennett, he was just another black man who didn't know his place. "I understand your concern," Marcus said carefully. "But this is my seat. I'd appreciate it if you could check your boarding pass and find your correct assignment." Olivia's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "My dear, I think you're confused about how things work here. This is first class, not—" She paused, letting her eyes travel over his casual clothing once more. "Well, not where people usually dress so casually." The words hit exactly as they were intended to. Marcus had heard variations of this theme his entire adult life. The questioning of his credentials, the assumptions about his background, the subtle and not-so-subtle suggestions that he didn't belong in spaces of privilege and power. What Olivia didn't know, what nobody on this plane knew, was that Marcus Reynolds wasn't just another passenger. 2 years ago, through a complex series of acquisitions orchestrated by his company, Horizon Technologies, he had quietly become the majority owner of Atlantic Airlines. 65% of the airline belonged to him, from the planes to the routes to the very seat that Olivia Bennett was now refusing to vacate. But Marcus had learned long ago that revealing power too early often led to accusations of arrogance or intimidation. Better to let situations reveal their true nature first, to see who people really were when they thought there would be no consequences for their actions. "I'm not confused about anything," Marcus replied, his tone remaining steady but gaining an edge that made a few nearby passengers look up from their phones. "This is my seat, and I'd like you to move." Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone she clearly viewed as beneath her social station. Her voice dropped to what she probably thought was a reasonable tone, but it carried the unmistakable accent of someone who had grown up with old money and older prejudices. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're trying to play here, but I'm not moving. I've been flying Atlantic for 14 years, and I know how these things work. If there's been some kind of error with the seating arrangements, I'm sure the airline will sort it out in a way that makes sense for everyone involved." The implication was crystal clear. Someone like Marcus didn't deserve to be in first class, regardless of what his boarding pass might say. It was the kind of casual racism that Olivia probably didn't even recognize in herself, wrapped in the language of reasonableness and procedure. Marcus felt his phone buzz in his pocket, probably Layla, his chief of staff, wondering why he hadn't checked in yet. There were emails to answer, calls to return, decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. But all of that faded into the background as he stood in the aisle of his own airplane, being told by a woman who had likely never worked a day in her life that he didn't belong in a seat he had not only paid for, but technically owned. The moment stretched between them, thick with tension and unspoken implications. Other first-class passengers had stopped pretending not to watch, their eyes darting between Marcus and Olivia like spectators at a tennis match. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, and a few wore expressions that suggested they were already choosing sides, based on nothing more than appearance and assumption. Marcus made his decision. This wasn't going to be one of those times when he quietly moved to keep the peace. "Not today, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a new authority that made Olivia's confident smile falter slightly. "I'm going to ask you one more time to move. This is my seat, and I intend to sit in it." Olivia Bennett's perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched in what she clearly intended to be an intimidating expression. Her designer handbag sat in the seat beside her like a territorial marker, while shopping bags from luxury stores occupied the floor space around her feet. Everything about her posture screamed ownership, not just of the seat, but of the entire first-class cabin and everyone in it. "I'm sorry, but I think you're misunderstanding the situation," she said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone that privileged people used when they wanted to sound reasonable while being anything but. "I'm Olivia Bennett. Perhaps you've heard of Bennett Real Estate Group. We develop luxury residential communities throughout the Northeast. I'm not some random passenger. I'm a VIP customer, and I specifically requested this seat." Marcus remained standing in the aisle, his boarding pass still in his hand, watching as Olivia performed what was clearly a well-rehearsed routine. He'd seen it before in boardrooms and networking events, the casual name-dropping, the assumption that credentials and connections could override basic fairness and decency. "Mrs. Bennett," Marcus said, emphasizing her name to show he'd heard it. "I'm sure you're very important in your line of work, but importance doesn't change seat assignments. This is 3A, and that's what my boarding pass says." Olivia's laugh was sharp and dismissive, the kind of sound that suggested she found the entire situation absurd. "Oh, sweetheart, you're taking this far too seriously. Look around you. Does this seem like the kind of mistake that usually happens? I mean, really, when was the last time you flew first class?" The question hung in the air like a slap. It was designed to humiliate, to force Marcus to admit that he didn't belong, that this was all some kind of mistake or misunderstanding, that a simple conversation could resolve. Olivia's eyes glittered with the confidence of someone who had never been told that her assumptions about other people might be wrong. But Marcus had been in enough high-stakes negotiations to recognize a power play when he saw one. Olivia wasn't confused about seat assignments. She was establishing dominance, testing to see if he would back down when faced with her social credentials and obvious wealth. "I fly first class every week," Marcus replied calmly, "usually on this same route. And in 3 years of flying Atlantic Airlines, I've never had someone refuse to move out of my assigned seat." Olivia's smile became more strained. She hadn't expected him to push back with such quiet confidence, and Marcus could see her recalculating the situation. Her eyes swept over him again, taking in his casual attire and young face, clearly trying to reconcile his composed demeanor with her preconceptions about who belonged in first class. "Well, then surely you understand how these things work," she said, her tone becoming more aggressive. "Sometimes accommodations need to be made. I have a connecting flight in Chicago, and I specifically need a window seat on the left side of the plane for the view. I'm sure Atlantic can find you another seat that meets your needs." Marcus felt his phone buzz again. This time, he glanced at it quickly. A text from Layla that read, "Board meeting moved to 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. Need you on the ground by noon. Everything okay?" Everything was definitely not okay, but not in the way Layla would expect. Marcus typed back quickly, "Flight delayed. Handle the prep calls. We'll be there." When he looked up, Olivia was watching him with renewed interest. "Important business?" she asked, and there was something almost mocking in her tone. "I do hope we're not keeping you from anything too urgent." "As a matter of fact," Marcus said, slipping his phone back into his pocket, "I do have important business, which is why I'd like to get settled in my assigned seat so we can take off on time." Olivia's expression hardened. The polite veneer was starting to crack, revealing something uglier underneath. "Listen to me very carefully," she said, leaning forward slightly. "I don't know what kind of scheme you're running here, but I'm not playing along. I know exactly what you're trying to do. Make a scene? Cause a fuss? Probably hoping for some kind of compensation or upgrade. Well, it's not going to work with me." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Marcus felt the familiar surge of anger that came whenever someone suggested that his legitimate presence in spaces of privilege was somehow fraudulent or opportunistic. It was the same assumption that had followed him through his entire career, that a successful black man must be running some kind of con game. "Mrs. Bennett," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, "I'm not running any scheme. I'm not looking for compensation or an upgrade. I'm simply trying to sit in the seat I paid for on the airline ticket I purchased legally and legitimately. If that threatens you somehow, that's your problem, not mine." Olivia's face flushed red. She wasn't used to being challenged so directly, especially not by someone she clearly viewed as socially inferior. Her voice rose slightly, loud enough that passengers in nearby rows couldn't help but overhear. "Threatens me? Don't flatter yourself. I'm trying to resolve this situation quietly and reasonably, but you're being deliberately difficult. I've offered you multiple alternatives, and you're refusing to be flexible. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Marcus almost smiled at that. If Olivia Bennett wanted to talk about character, they could certainly have that conversation. But not here. Not like this. Not when she was still operating under the assumption that she held all the power in this interaction. "My character," Marcus repeated slowly. Interesting choice of words. "Tell me, Mrs. Bennett, what exactly does my character have to do with your refusal to move out of my assigned seat?" Olivia opened her mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, she reached for the call button above her head and pressed it firmly. The soft chime echoed through the first-class cabin, and Marcus could see other passengers turning to watch what was clearly escalating from a simple misunderstanding to something more confrontational. "I think it's time to get the flight attendant involved," Olivia announced, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "Obviously, we need someone with authority to resolve this situation properly." Marcus nodded slowly. "I think that's an excellent idea," he said. "Let's get someone with authority involved." The irony of that statement would become apparent soon enough. The soft footsteps of regulation airline shoes on carpeted flooring announced the arrival of Rachel Miller, a 32-year-old flight attendant whose perfectly pressed uniform and practiced smile suggested she'd handled her share of passenger disputes. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her hazel eyes moved quickly between Marcus and Olivia, already assessing the situation before she'd heard a word from either party. "Good afternoon," Rachel said, her voice carrying the trained cheerfulness of someone who had learned to diffuse tensions before they exploded into full-scale incidents. "I understand there's some confusion about seating arrangements. How can I help resolve this for you?" Olivia immediately leaned forward, her voice taking on the tone of an aggrieved victim who had been suffering in silence until forced to speak up. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I'm Olivia Bennett, Atlantic Platinum member for over 14 years. I've been sitting in this seat, which I specifically requested when I booked, and this gentleman is claiming it's his. Rachel's eyes flicked to Marcus, and he caught something in her expression that he'd seen countless times before. It wasn't malicious exactly, but it was telling, a subtle shift that suggested she was already forming assumptions about who was likely telling the truth and who was likely causing trouble. "Sir," Rachel said, turning to Marcus with a smile that was noticeably less warm than the one she'd given Olivia. "May I see your boarding pass?" Marcus handed it over without comment, watching as Rachel examined it carefully. Her frown deepened as she looked from the boarding pass to the seat number above Olivia's head, clearly seeing that Marcus was in fact assigned to 3A. "Well," Rachel said slowly, "it does appear that this seat is assigned to you, mister." She glanced at the boarding pass again. "Mr. Reynolds. However, I can see that Mrs. Bennett is already settled in, and she does have a very high status with our airline." Marcus felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd seen this dance before. The careful, diplomatic language that somehow always seemed to suggest that the black passenger should be the one to compromise, to be flexible, to understand that maintaining harmony was more important than maintaining his rights. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Marcus asked quietly. Rachel's smile became more strained. "Well, we do have several other excellent seats available in first class. Perhaps we could move you to 4B. It's an aisle seat with excellent legroom, and I'd be happy to make sure you receive priority service throughout the flight as compensation for the inconvenience." "The inconvenience?" Marcus repeated slowly. "You mean the inconvenience of someone else sitting in my assigned seat?" Olivia sensed an opening and took it. "I think that's a very reasonable solution," she said quickly. "I've already arranged my belongings here, and as I mentioned, I have specific needs related to my connecting flight. I'm sure Mr. Reynolds understands that sometimes flexibility is required when traveling." Rachel nodded encouragingly. Mrs. Bennett does have a point. These kinds of mix-ups happen occasionally, and we've found that the best solution is usually the one that accommodates everyone's needs with minimal disruption. Marcus looked around the first-class cabin. Several passengers were now openly watching the exchange, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. He could see an older black couple in row 5 who were watching with expressions that suggested they knew exactly what was happening and had probably experienced similar situations themselves. In row 4, a Latina woman with a press badge clipped to her jacket was watching intently, her phone discreetly positioned as if she might be recording. Her dark eyes met Marcus's for a moment, and he caught something in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or simply the understanding that this was about more than just a seating dispute. Near the window in row 6, a young Asian woman with multiple electronic devices was definitely recording, though she was trying to be subtle about it. Her fingers moved quickly across her phone screen, and Marcus could see the telltale glow of a live stream interface. "I appreciate the suggestion," Marcus said, finally turning back to Rachel. "But I'd like to sit in my assigned seat, the seat I paid for. The seat that's clearly marked on my boarding pass." Rachel's professional smile began to crack slightly. "Mr. Reynolds, I understand your position, but I'm trying to find a solution that works for everyone. Mrs. Bennett is one of our most valued customers, and I'm not," Marcus interrupted gently. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly realizing that any answer she gave would be problematic. Olivia, however, had no such hesitation. "Oh, please," she said with a dismissive wave. "This is ridiculous. I've been an Atlantic customer for over a decade. I fly first class on this route at least twice a month. I know the crew. I know the procedures. And I know how these things are supposed to work." She turned to Rachel with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that her complaints would be taken seriously. "I specifically requested this seat when I booked. If there's been some kind of computer error or overbooking situation, that's not my problem to solve. I'm already seated. I'm already settled. And I have no intention of moving." Marcus felt his phone buzz again. Without looking at it, he could guess it was another message from Layla. Probably wondering about the delay, the irony wasn't lost on him. He was getting updates about his own airline while being told by one of his own flight attendants that he should give up his seat to keep a racist customer happy. Mrs. Bennett, Marcus said, his voice still calm but gaining an edge that made several nearby passengers look up. You keep talking about how long you've been an Atlantic customer. Let me ask you something. In all those years of flying with this airline, how many times have you refused to move out of someone else's assigned seat? Olivia's eyes flashed with anger. I'm not refusing anything. I'm sitting in the seat I booked, exactly as any reasonable person would expect to do. Except you didn't book this seat, Marcus pointed out. If you had, you'd have a boarding pass that showed 3A. Instead, you're just sitting here and hoping that your status as a valued customer will let you take whatever you want. Rachel stepped between them, clearly sensing that the situation was escalating beyond her ability to manage with standard customer service protocols. Sir, ma'am, let's all take a step back here. I'm sure we can work this out without anyone getting upset. I'm not upset, Marcus said quietly. I'm just tired of being told that other people's comfort is more important than my confirmed reservation. Olivia laughed, a sharp sound that carried clearly through the cabin. Your confirmed reservation? Please, we both know what this is really about. You're hoping to create enough of a scene that you'll get some kind of compensation or special treatment. Well, I've seen this act before, and it's not going to work. The accusation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Marcus felt every eye in the first-class cabin turn toward him, waiting to see how he would respond to being called a fraud and a manipulator in front of a plane full of strangers. He looked at Olivia for a long moment, then at Rachel, then at the passengers who were watching with varying degrees of interest and discomfort. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that people had to strain to hear him. You have no idea what you just started. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted from uncomfortable to electric. Olivia Bennett's accusation that Marcus was running some kind of compensation scheme had crossed a line, and everyone present seemed to sense that they were no longer witnessing a simple seating dispute, but something much more significant. Rachel Miller looked between the two passengers with growing alarm, clearly realizing that her standard conflict resolution training hadn't prepared her for this level of tension. Her hand moved instinctively toward the phone that would connect her to the cockpit, but she hesitated, uncertain whether the situation warranted escalating to the captain's level. Perhaps, Rachel said, her voice strained with forced cheer. I should get Captain Morgan involved. He has more authority to handle these kinds of complex situations. Olivia's face lit up with vindictive satisfaction. Yes, I think that's an excellent idea. Let's get someone in charge who can explain proper procedures to Mr. Reynolds here. Marcus nodded slowly. Please do. I'd very much like to speak with someone in authority. As Rachel hurried toward the cockpit, the silence in the cabin was broken by a clear, professional voice from row 4. Excuse me, but I couldn't help noticing what just happened here. All eyes turned to Carmen Diaz, the Latina woman with the press badge. She was in her mid-40s with silver-streaked black hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of asking difficult questions in hostile environments. Her business card, which she now held up for everyone to see, identified her as a senior correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. I'm Carmen Diaz, and I cover transportation and civil rights issues for the Tribune. I've been watching this entire interaction, and I have to say, Mrs. Bennett, your behavior has been absolutely inappropriate from the beginning. Olivia's mouth fell open. Excuse me, I beg your pardon, but this is none of your business. Carmen smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. Actually, discrimination in public accommodations is very much my business. I've covered dozens of cases like this, and I can tell you exactly what I'm seeing here. A black man with a legitimate boarding pass is being told to give up his seat to accommodate a white woman who has no boarding pass for that seat, simply because she claims to be a valued customer. The young woman in row 6, Mia Zhang, though nobody knew her name yet, lowered her phone slightly and spoke up. I've been live streaming this whole thing to my followers. We're up to about 700 viewers now, and let me tell you, the comments are not kind to you, lady. Olivia whirled around to face Mia, her face flushing red with anger and embarrassment. You've been filming this? You can't do that. I don't consent to being recorded. Mia shrugged, a gesture that managed to convey both innocence and defiance. Actually, this is a public space, and I'm documenting what appears to be a civil rights violation. My viewers are very interested in what's happening here. Civil rights violation? Olivia sputtered. This is a seating dispute. You people are blowing this completely out of proportion. The phrase "you people" hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Several passengers audibly gasped, and Marcus felt something shift in his chest, not anger exactly, but a cold, calculating focus that he recognized from his most challenging business negotiations. Carmen Diaz was already typing notes on her phone. Did you just say "you people," Mrs. Bennett? In the context of a discussion about racial discrimination? I want to make sure I quote you accurately. Olivia realized her mistake immediately. That's not what I meant. I was referring to journalists and social media people, not... I'm not a racist. Marcus spoke for the first time since Rachel had left to get the captain, his voice carrying a new authority that made everyone in the cabin pay attention. Mrs. Bennett, you've now accused me of running a compensation scheme, suggested that I don't belong in first class, and used the phrase "you people" when describing those who are documenting your behavior. If you're not a racist, you're doing an excellent impression of one. How dare you? Olivia shot back. I have black friends. I donate to charity. I would never... You would never what? Carmen interjected. Assume that a black man in casual clothes doesn't belong in first class, because that's exactly what you did. Suggest that his presence in your preferred seat is somehow fraudulent, because that's exactly what you said. Refuse to acknowledge his legitimate boarding pass while insisting on your own imaginary rights, because that's exactly what's happening right now. Before Olivia could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of Captain David Morgan, a 54-year-old veteran pilot whose weathered face and graying temples spoke to decades of experience dealing with difficult situations at 30,000 feet. Behind him walked Rachel Miller, looking relieved to have passed the problem up the chain of command. Good afternoon, everyone, Captain Morgan said, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. I understand we have a seating issue that needs to be resolved quickly so we can maintain our departure schedule. Olivia immediately stood, extending her hand with the gracious smile of someone confident that authority figures would naturally take her side. Captain Morgan, thank you so much for coming. I'm Olivia Bennett, Atlantic Platinum member. I'm afraid there's been some kind of computer error with the seat assignments, and this gentleman is being quite unreasonable about finding a solution. Captain Morgan shook her hand politely, then turned to Marcus. And you are? Marcus Reynolds. Marcus replied, not offering his hand but maintaining steady eye contact. This is my boarding pass, showing my assignment to seat 3A. Mrs. Bennett has been sitting in my seat since boarding, and refuses to move despite having no boarding pass for this seat. The captain examined Marcus's boarding pass carefully, then looked around the first-class cabin, taking in the watching passengers and the obvious tension in the air. Mr. Reynolds, I can see that you're assigned to this seat. However, Mrs. Bennett is a valued, long-time customer, and I'm sure we can find an accommodation that works for everyone. Marcus felt the familiar disappointment that came with watching people in authority positions choose the path of least resistance rather than simple fairness. Captain, what accommodation would you suggest? That I give up the seat I paid for, so that Mrs. Bennett can sit wherever she chooses. Captain Morgan shifted uncomfortably. Well, we do have other available seats in first class. Sometimes these situations require a little flexibility from everyone involved. Carmen Diaz spoke up from her seat. Captain Morgan, I'm Carmen Diaz from the Chicago Tribune. Are you seriously suggesting that Mr. Reynolds should give up his assigned seat simply because Mrs. Bennett doesn't want to move? Because if that's Atlantic Airlines' official policy, I'd like to get that on record. The captain's eyes widened as he recognized the implications of having a national journalist witness and document the situation. Ma'am, this is just a simple customer service issue. We're trying to find a solution that makes everyone comfortable. Comfortable for whom? Carmen pressed. Comfortable for the white woman who took someone else's seat, or comfortable for the black man who's being asked to give up his rights to avoid conflict? Mia Zhang lowered her phone so everyone could see the screen. My viewers are asking if this is how Atlantic Airlines normally handles discrimination complaints. We're up to over 1,500 people watching now, and someone just shared it to Twitter. The hashtag #AtlanticShame is starting to trend. Captain Morgan looked around the cabin with growing alarm, clearly realizing that what had started as a simple passenger dispute was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare. Ladies and gentlemen, I assure you that Atlantic Airlines does not discriminate against anyone. We're simply trying to resolve a seating conflict. Marcus stood up slowly, his full height making him an imposing presence in the narrow confines of the first-class cabin. When he spoke, his voice carried a new edge that made everyone pay attention. Captain Morgan, let me be very clear about something. Mrs. Bennett is sitting in my seat. She has no boarding pass for this seat. She has refused multiple requests to move. Your flight attendant suggested that I should be the one to relocate despite having the legitimate seat assignment. You've now endorsed that same suggestion. At what point does this stop being customer service and start being discrimination? The captain opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus held up a hand to stop him. I'm not finished. Mrs. Bennett has accused me of running a compensation scheme, suggested that people like me don't usually fly first class, and used the phrase, "you people," when describing those who object to her behavior. All of this has been witnessed by multiple passengers, and recorded by at least one of them. So let me ask you directly, Captain Morgan, is it Atlantic Airlines' policy that white passengers can take any seat they want as long as they claim to be valued customers? The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the cabin was fixed on Captain Morgan, waiting to see how he would respond to being put on the spot so directly and publicly. Finally, Olivia Bennett broke the silence with a laugh that sounded more like a shriek. This is insane! I refuse to be lectured by someone who probably got his ticket through some kind of affirmative action program or diversity initiative. Real first-class passengers don't dress like they're going to the gym. The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. Several passengers gasped audibly, and Marcus felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. Carmen Diaz was typing furiously on her phone. Mrs. Bennett, did you just suggest that Mr. Reynolds couldn't have legitimately purchased a first-class ticket? And did you reference affirmative action in the context of airline seating? Olivia realized she'd gone too far, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. I'm just saying that there are procedures for these things, and people who belong in first class generally understand how to dress appropriately and behave with some decorum. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then at Captain Morgan, then at the dozen or so passengers who were watching with expressions ranging from horror to fascination. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the cabin. Captain Morgan, I need to ask you to ground this aircraft immediately. Captain Morgan blinked as if he hadn't heard correctly. I'm sorry, Mr. Reynolds, but did you just ask me to ground the aircraft? I didn't ask, Marcus replied, his tone still conversational but carrying an unmistakable authority that made several passengers sit up straighter. I told you, ground this aircraft. We're not taking off until this situation is properly resolved. Olivia Bennett laughed, a sound that was becoming increasingly shrill with each exchange. Oh, this is Rich. Now he thinks he can give orders to the captain. What's next? Are you going to demand they roll out a red carpet for you? Captain Morgan looked genuinely confused. In 30 years of flying, he'd dealt with difficult passengers, medical emergencies, mechanical failures, and weather delays. But he'd never had a passenger simply order him to ground a flight. Mr. Reynolds, I appreciate that you're frustrated, but passengers don't have the authority to make operational decisions about aircraft. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Captain, I'm going to make a phone call. I suggest you listen very carefully to what happens next. Carmen Diaz leaned forward in her seat, her journalist's instincts telling her that something significant was about to happen. Mia Zhang adjusted her phone to get a better angle, her viewer count now climbing past 2,000 as word of the confrontation spread across social media. Marcus tapped his phone screen a few times, then held it up so everyone could see. Instead of making a call, he had opened an app that none of the passengers recognized, a sleek interface with the Atlantic Airlines logo at the top and what appeared to be various operational controls below it. What is that? Rachel Miller asked, stepping closer to get a better look at the screen. This, Ms. Miller, is the executive control panel for Atlantic Airlines operations. And this, he tapped the screen, is what happens when someone pushes a CEO too far. The app processed for a moment, then displayed a confirmation message. Flight 492, grounded by owner directive. Return to gate immediately. Captain Morgan's radio crackled to life almost instantly. Flight 492, this is tower control. We're showing a CEO override order on your flight. Please confirm your status and return to gate immediately. The captain stared at his radio, then at Marcus, then back at his radio. Tower, this is Captain Morgan. Can you repeat that message? Did you say CEO override? Affirmative, Captain. We're showing an order directly from Horizon Technologies' corporate office to ground your flight immediately. You're cleared to taxi back to gate B12. Olivia Bennett's face had gone pale. What? What just happened? What did you do? Marcus pocketed his phone and looked at her with an expression that was almost pitying. Mrs. Bennett, allow me to properly introduce myself. My name is Marcus Reynolds. I am the CEO of Horizon Technologies, which owns 65% of Atlantic Airlines. In other words, I don't just have a seat on this airplane. I own the airplane. The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the low hum of the aircraft's environmental systems. Every passenger in the first-class cabin stared at Marcus as if he had just announced that he was from Mars. Carmen Diaz was the first to break the silence, her voice carrying the excitement of a journalist who had just stumbled onto the story of a lifetime. You're Marcus Reynolds, the Horizon CEO? The one who's been on the cover of Forbes and Fortune? The guy who revolutionized airline booking systems with blockchain technology? Marcus nodded. The same. And Mrs. Bennett, since you were so curious about my qualifications to sit in first class, I should mention that Horizon software powers the reservation system that processed your ticket, the check-in kiosks you used at the airport, and the passenger manifest that Captain Morgan has been consulting throughout this conversation. Olivia's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But you're dressed like… you look like… Like what, Mrs. Bennett? Marcus asked quietly. Like someone who doesn't belong in first class? Like someone who couldn't possibly afford to buy his own airline? Like someone whose presence in spaces of wealth and power must be the result of fraud or charity? Captain Morgan had gone silent, presumably processing the fact that he had just spent the last 20 minutes suggesting that the owner of his airline should be more flexible about giving up his seat. His radio crackled again. Captain Morgan, this is Atlantic Operations. We need you to return to the gate immediately. There's going to be a corporate representative meeting the aircraft, and we need all passengers to remain on board until further notice. Rachel Miller looked like she was about to be sick. Mr. Reynolds, sir, I had no idea. I was just trying to… You were trying to make the problem go away by asking the black passenger to be accommodating. Marcus finished for her. I understand, Ms. Miller. It's what you've been trained to do. Find the person who looks like they have the least power and ask them to compromise so that the person who looks like they have the most power doesn't have to be inconvenienced. Mia Zhang's phone was buzzing with notifications as her live stream exploded across social media. Holy, wow, she whispered, then caught herself. Sorry, this is incredible. The viewer count just jumped to over 7,000. Someone shared this to TikTok, and it's already got 15,000 views. Olivia finally found her voice again, though it came out as more of a croak. I didn't know. How was I supposed to? Supposed to what? Carmen Diaz interjected, her pen moving rapidly across her notepad. Treat him with basic human respect? Accept that he had a legitimate boarding pass? Not assume that a black man in casual clothes must be running some kind of scam? Marcus felt his phone buzz and glanced at it quickly. A text from Layla read, Marcus? What the hell is happening? Social media is exploding. Something about you grounding a flight. Call me immediately. Instead of calling Layla, Marcus typed back quickly, handle all media inquiries. Draft statement about discrimination in air travel. Schedule emergency board meeting for this afternoon. This is going to be big. As the aircraft began its taxi back to the gate, Marcus looked around the first-class cabin at the faces staring back at him. Some looked shocked, others embarrassed, and a few seemed excited to be witnessing what was clearly going to become a major news story. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, his voice carrying easily through the cabin, "I want you to understand something. What happened here today wasn't about me. It wasn't about my airline or my money or my position. It was about what happens every day to people who look like me when they try to exist in spaces where they're not expected to belong." He looked directly at Olivia, who was now slumped in her seat as if trying to disappear. Mrs. Bennett refused to acknowledge my legitimate boarding pass because she couldn't believe that someone like me belonged in first class. Ms. Miller suggested that I should be the one to move because it would be easier than making a valued customer face consequences for her actions. Captain Morgan endorsed that suggestion because he assumed that I would be the reasonable one, the one who would compromise to keep the peace. The aircraft came to a stop at the gate, and Marcus could see through the windows that a small crowd was gathering on the jet bridge. Some appeared to be airport officials. Others looked like reporters who had somehow gotten word of the story. Every single assumption made about me today was based on nothing more than the color of my skin and my choice to wear comfortable clothes while traveling. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly the kind of discrimination that I intend to make sure never happens again on any aircraft that I own. Olivia Bennett finally looked up from her hands, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Reynolds, I'm so sorry. I had no idea who you were. I never meant." Marcus's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "Mrs. Bennett, that's exactly the problem. You didn't know who I was, so you felt entitled to treat me as less than human. The issue isn't that you didn't recognize me as a CEO. The issue is that you didn't recognize me as a person deserving of the same respect you'd want for yourself." As the jet bridge connected to the aircraft and the doors opened, Marcus stood and gathered his belongings. The first-class cabin remained silent as everyone waited to see what would happen next. "Captain Morgan, Ms. Miller," Marcus said as he prepared to exit, "I'll be speaking with you both individually very soon. Mrs. Bennett, you'll be hearing from our legal department regarding your permanent ban from all Atlantic Airlines flights." He paused at the aircraft door and turned back to face the cabin one more time. "And to everyone else who witnessed what happened here today, thank you. Your attention and your willingness to document the truth are the only reasons this story will be heard. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to look away." With that, Marcus Reynolds walked off his own airplane, leaving behind a cabin full of people who were still trying to process what they had just experienced. The jet bridge buzzed with controlled chaos as Marcus stepped off the aircraft. Airport security personnel flanked both sides of the walkway, while a small group of what appeared to be Atlantic Airlines executives huddled near the gate counter, speaking in urgent whispers. Beyond them, Marcus could see several people with cameras and notepads who had somehow materialized in the 30 minutes since his flight had been grounded. But it was the young black woman in an expensive suit who caught Marcus's attention first. Layla Washington, his 28-year-old chief of staff, was practically vibrating with nervous energy as she approached, her phone pressed to her ear and a tablet tucked under her arm. "Marcus, thank God," Layla said, ending her call quickly. "I've been fielding calls for the last 20 minutes. The story is everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Even CNN just picked it up. What the hell happened up there?" Marcus glanced back at the aircraft where passengers were slowly deplaning under the watchful eyes of airport security. Olivia Bennett emerged, looking like she'd aged 10 years in the past hour, her designer clothes rumpled and her perfect makeup streaked with tears. Behind her came Carmen Diaz, who was already on her phone, presumably calling in the story to her editors at the Chicago Tribune. "What happened," Marcus said quietly, "is that I got tired of being treated like a criminal for existing while black in first class." Layla's eyes widened as she pulled up various social media feeds on her tablet. "Marcus, look at this. The hashtag Atlantic Shame hashtag is trending worldwide. The video from that college student, Mia something, has been viewed over 1 million times in the past hour. And Carmen Diaz just posted a preliminary story that's already being shared everywhere." Marcus scanned the headlines that Layla showed him. Black CEO grounds own airline after racist treatment. Atlantic Airlines in crisis after discrimination incident. Horizon CEO faces down racism at 30,000 feet. The stock? Marcus asked. Atlantic is down 14% in after-hours trading. But here's the weird thing. Horizon shares are up 10%. Investors seem to be viewing this as a positive leadership moment for you personally, even if they're concerned about Atlantic's reputation. A woman in an Atlantic Airlines uniform approached them, her face grave. "Mr. Reynolds, I'm Jennifer Torres, VP of Operations. I need to speak with you immediately about the incident on Flight 492. Marcus nodded. "Miss Torres, I assume you've been briefed on what happened." "I've seen the video," Jennifer replied, her tone carefully neutral. "And I've received preliminary reports from Captain Morgan and Flight Attendant Miller. Mr. Reynolds, I want you to know that Atlantic Airways takes any allegation of discrimination very seriously, and we're prepared to conduct a full investigation into the incident." "An investigation?" Marcus repeated slowly. "Ms. Torres, are you investigating whether discrimination occurred, or are you investigating how to minimize the PR damage?" Jennifer's professional composure slipped slightly. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but we need to handle this through proper channels. There are procedures for these kinds of complaints, and those procedures," Marcus interrupted, "typically involve asking the victim to file a report that gets buried in a file somewhere, while the employees involved receive a brief reminder about customer service protocols. Is that about right?" Layla leaned closer to Marcus and whispered, "The board is convening an emergency meeting in 2 hours. They want to know how you plan to handle this publicly." Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching as the last passengers deplaned from Flight 492. Mia Zhang emerged with her phone still recording, speaking rapidly to her camera about what she had witnessed. Captain Morgan and Rachel Miller exited together, both looking like they were walking to their own execution. "Miss Torres," Marcus said finally, "I want you to understand something. This isn't going to be handled through normal procedures. This isn't going to be buried in a file or resolved with diversity training and a public apology. This is going to be handled publicly, transparently, and completely." Jennifer's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Reynolds, with respect, I think you should consider the broader implications of making this a public grievances." Marcus almost smiled at that. "Personal grievances, Miss Torres? Do you think what happened on that aircraft was a personal spectacle? The airline industry is highly regulated, and the FAA takes a very dim view of using aircraft for personal grievances." Marcus almost smiled at that. "Personal grievances, Miss Torres? Do you think what happened on that aircraft was a personal grievance?" "I think it was a misunderstanding that escalated due to poor communication and unfortunate assumptions on all sides," Jennifer replied carefully. Carmen Diaz had finished her phone call and was now approaching the group, her press credentials clearly visible and her notepad ready. "Mr. Reynolds, Carmen Diaz, Chicago Tribune, could I get a comment on Atlantic Airlines' response to today's incident?" Marcus looked at Jennifer Torres, then at Carmen, then at the small crowd of media personnel who were now gathering near the gate. "Ms. Diaz, I'll be making a full statement shortly, but I will say this. What happened today on Flight 492 is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of systemic problems in the airline industry, and those problems are going to be addressed comprehensively." Jennifer stepped forward quickly. "Mr. Reynolds, I really think we should discuss this privately before making any public statements. There are liability issues to consider, and—" "Ms. Torres," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority that had made him one of the youngest CEOs in the Fortune 500, "I own this airline. I don't need to discuss liability issues with my own employees. What I need is for you to immediately suspend Captain Morgan and Rachel Miller pending a full investigation, implement mandatory bias training for all customer-facing personnel, and prepare a comprehensive report on discrimination complaints filed against Atlantic Airlines over the past 5 years." Jennifer's mouth fell open. "Sir, that's not how we typically handle these situations. Union contracts require specific procedures for disciplinary actions, and—" "Then change the procedures," Marcus said simply. "I want those suspensions processed within the hour. I want the training program designed and implemented within 60 days, and I want that discrimination report on my desk by the end of the week." Layla was typing rapidly on her tablet, documenting Marcus's instructions. "I'm sending these directives to legal and HR right now," she murmured. Carmen Diaz looked up from her notepad. "Mr. Reynolds, are you planning to make changes beyond just Atlantic Airlines? Your company's software is used by most major airlines. Do you see this as an industry-wide problem?" Marcus considered the question carefully. Through the large windows overlooking the tarmac, he could see Flight 492 being serviced for its eventual departure to Chicago. In a few hours, it would be just another routine flight carrying passengers who had no idea that they had been part of a moment that was about to reshape how airlines thought about discrimination and customer service. Ms. Diaz. Marcus said what happened today could happen on any airline, in any airport, to any person who doesn't fit someone else's preconceptions about who belongs where. The fact that it happened to me, someone with the power and platform to do something about it, means that it's my responsibility to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Jennifer Torres was speaking urgently into her own phone, presumably reporting back to Atlantic's executive team about Marcus's demands. Marcus could hear fragments of her conversation. Completely unreasonable. Union issues. PR nightmare. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He glanced at it quickly and saw, "Mr. Reynolds, this is Mia Zhang from the flight. My video has 6 million views and counting. I wanted you to know that 99% of the comments are supporting you. People are sharing their own stories of airline discrimination. This is becoming something huge. Layla," Marcus said, "I want you to reach out to that college student, Mia Zhang. Offer her an interview with our corporate communications team. If she's willing, I want her to be part of the solution going forward." Carmen Diaz had been watching this exchange with growing interest. "Mr. Reynolds, it sounds like you're planning something much bigger than just addressing one incident. Are you thinking about systematic changes across the entire industry?" Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then at the small crowd of reporters who were now hanging on his every word. Then at Jennifer Torres, who was still speaking frantically into her phone. "Ms. Diaz, I'm thinking about making sure that what happened to me today never happens to anyone else, ever. Regardless of what airline they're flying, what they're wearing, or how much money they have in their bank account." He paused, looking around at the faces watching him, all waiting to see what the young black CEO would do with the platform that discrimination had inadvertently given him. "I'm thinking about changing everything." As if on cue, his phone rang. The caller ID showed CNN Newsroom. Marcus looked at the phone, then at Carmen Diaz, then at the crowd of people who were documenting every moment of what was clearly becoming a major news story. He answered the call. "This is Marcus Reynolds." "Mr. Reynolds, this is Anderson Cooper from CNN. I'm calling about the incident on Atlantic Airlines Flight 492. Would you be willing to do a live interview within the next 30 minutes? Marcus glanced around at the crowd that had gathered in the gate area. What had started as a simple flight delay had evolved into a media circus, with reporters, airport officials, and curious passengers creating an impromptu press conference atmosphere around Gate B12. "Mr. Cooper," Marcus said, putting the call on speaker so that Carmen Diaz and the other journalists could hear. "I'll be happy to speak with you, but I want to be clear about something. This isn't just about one incident on one flight. This is about systematic discrimination that happens every day in the airline industry, and I'm planning to do something about it." Anderson Cooper's voice carried clearly through the phone's speaker. "Mr. Reynolds, we've seen the video that's gone viral, and we've been in contact with several passengers from Flight 492. Can you tell us exactly what happened from your perspective?" Marcus looked directly into Carmen Diaz's eyes as he answered. "What happened is that I was treated like a criminal and a fraud, simply because I'm a black man who had the audacity to sit in a first-class seat. Mrs. Olivia Bennett took my assigned seat and refused to move despite having no boarding pass for that seat. When I asked her to move, she suggested that I didn't belong in first class and accused me of running some kind of compensation scam." Jennifer Torres stepped closer, making frantic gestures for Marcus to end the call, but he ignored her completely. The flight attendant, Rachel Miller, suggested that I should be the one to move to avoid trouble, even though I had the legitimate seat assignment. Captain Morgan endorsed that suggestion and implied that I should be flexible to accommodate Mrs. Bennett's preferences. When I refused to give up my seat, Mrs. Bennett escalated to personal attacks, including references to affirmative action and the phrase, "you people." Murmurs rippled through the crowd of listeners as Marcus laid out the timeline of events. Several people were recording with their phones, and Marcus could see Layla taking detailed notes on her tablet. "Mr. Reynolds," Anderson Cooper continued, "we understand that you ultimately grounded the aircraft. Can you explain that decision?" Marcus pulled out his phone and held it up so the crowd could see the Horizon CEO app that was still open on his screen. Mr. Cooper, what many people don't realize is that I'm not just a passenger who was discriminated against. Through my company, Horizon Technologies, I own 65% of Atlantic Airlines. When it became clear that my own employees were willing to tolerate and enable discriminatory behavior rather than simply enforce basic fairness, I used my authority as the majority owner to ground the flight. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Even though some of them had witnessed the moment on the aircraft, hearing it explained in this context made the full implications clear. "You grounded your own airline?" Cooper asked, his voice carrying a note of amazement. "I grounded one flight," Marcus corrected, to make a point about accountability. Mrs. Bennett, Captain Morgan, and Rachel Miller all assumed that they could treat me however they wanted because they believed I had no power to do anything about it. They were wrong. Jennifer Torres was now speaking urgently into her own phone, presumably getting instructions from Atlantic's board of directors about how to handle the rapidly escalating situation. Marcus could hear fragments of her conversation: stock price, legal implications, damage control. Carmen Diaz stepped forward and spoke loudly enough for the phone to pick up her voice. "Mr. Reynolds, Carmen Diaz from the Chicago Tribune. What do you plan to do going forward? Is this just about Atlantic Airlines, or are you thinking about broader changes?" Marcus smiled for the first time since the incident began. "Ms. Diaz, I'm planning to revolutionize how the airline industry handles discrimination, starting immediately. Atlantic Airlines will implement the most comprehensive anti-discrimination training and reporting system in the industry. But that's just the beginning." He paused, looking around at the faces watching him with growing anticipation. Horizon's reservation software powers booking and passenger management systems for over 70% of commercial airlines in North America. We're going to integrate bias detection and reporting mechanisms directly into those systems. If a passenger files a discrimination complaint, it will be automatically escalated to corporate level and tracked until resolution. No more burying complaints in local files or dismissing them as misunderstandings. Anderson Cooper's voice carried excitement now. "Mr. Reynolds, are you saying you're going to use your technological platform to force industry-wide changes in how airlines handle discrimination?" "I'm saying I'm going to use every tool at my disposal to make sure that what happened to me today never happens to anyone else," Marcus replied. "And if other airlines don't want to participate voluntarily, they can find different software providers." The implications of that statement hit the crowd like a physical force. Horizon's near monopoly on airline reservation systems meant that Marcus Reynolds could effectively force industry-wide policy changes simply by updating his software. Layla looked up from her tablet, her eyes wide. "Marcus, Twitter is exploding. Hashtag systemic change is now trending alongside hashtag Atlantic shame. Stock futures are reacting in real time. Airlines are down, but tech stocks focused on social justice are surging." Jennifer Torres finally ended her phone call and approached Marcus with what appeared to be a mixture of desperation and resignation on her face. "Mr. Reynolds, I've just spoken with our board chairman. He wants to know if there's any way we can resolve this situation privately before it becomes a larger crisis." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then at the crowd of reporters and onlookers who were hanging on every word of his conversation with CNN. "Ms. Torres," he said, making sure his voice carried clearly through Anderson Cooper's phone connection, "the time for private resolution was when your employees first decided to discriminate against me. That opportunity passed when Captain Morgan endorsed the discrimination. It was completely gone when Mrs. Bennett started making references to affirmative action and, you people." He held up his phone so everyone could see the screen. "This is no longer about one flight or one incident. This is about using the platform that discrimination inadvertently gave me to create lasting, systematic change." "Mr. Reynolds," Anderson Cooper's voice came through the speaker, "we're getting reports that your story is trending internationally now. People are sharing their own experiences with airline discrimination, and several civil rights organizations have already issued statements supporting your actions. Do you see this as a turning point for the industry?" Marcus considered the question carefully. Around him, the crowd had grown to include not just journalists and airport personnel, but passengers from other flights who had heard about the incident and come to witness the impromptu press conference. "Mr. Cooper," Marcus said finally, "I see this as a moment when someone with power decided to use that power responsibly. For too long, discrimination in air travel has been treated as a customer service issue rather than a civil rights violation. That stops today. He looked directly into Carmen Diaz's eyes as he continued, "I have the resources, the platform, and the technology to force changes that civil rights advocates have been fighting for decades. The only question was whether I would choose to use those advantages to benefit just myself or to create opportunities for everyone who looks like me." Jennifer Torres stepped forward one more time. "Mr. Reynolds, please, I'm begging you to consider the broader implications. Thousands of people work for Atlantic Airlines. The changes you're talking about could have massive economic impacts." Marcus's expression hardened. "Ms. Torres, are you suggesting that I should tolerate discrimination to protect the economic interests of a company that employs people who discriminate against customers?" The question hung in the air unanswered because Jennifer Torres clearly realized that any response would be problematic. Anderson Cooper's voice came through the phone again. "Mr. Reynolds, we're going to break for a commercial, but when we come back, I'd like to discuss the specific policy changes you're planning to implement. Are you available for a full interview in our New York studio tomorrow morning?" Marcus looked at Layla, who was already checking schedules on her tablet. "Mr. Cooper, I'll be there. And I'll have a comprehensive announcement about the future of anti-discrimination efforts in the airline industry." As he ended the call with CNN, Marcus realized that he had just committed himself to a course of action that would reshape not just his own company, but potentially the entire airline industry. The young black CEO, who had just wanted to fly home in peace, had become the focal point of a national conversation about discrimination, power, and corporate responsibility. The question now was whether he was ready for everything that came next. Looking around at the faces watching him, some hopeful, others curious, a few even resentful, Marcus Reynolds knew the answer. He had spent his entire life preparing for this moment, even if he hadn't known it was coming. The casual discrimination he had faced on Flight 492 wasn't unique. What was unique was his ability to do something about it that would affect systemic change. "Let's get to work," he said to Layla, handing her his phone. "We have an industry to transform." As they walked away from the gate, Marcus could hear the buzz of conversations behind him, feel the weight of expectations on his shoulders, and sense the momentum of a movement beginning to build. Sometimes the most profound changes started with the simplest acts of dignity. Refusing to give up a seat that was rightfully yours, insisting on basic respect, and using whatever power you had to ensure that others would never have to fight the same battles. For Marcus Reynolds, the journey that began in Seat 3A was just getting started. And for the airline industry, nothing would ever be quite the same again. 2 years had passed since the day Marcus Reynolds had refused to give up his seat on Atlantic Airlines Flight 492. What had begun as a simple seating dispute had blossomed into a transformative movement that was reshaping not just the airline industry, but how corporations across America address discrimination and bias. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Horizon Technology's Chicago headquarters as Marcus reviewed the latest quarterly report on discrimination prevention. The data showed a 78% reduction in bias incidents across partner airlines since the implementation of what industry insiders now called the Reynolds Protocol, a comprehensive set of policies, training programs, and technological safeguards designed to detect, address, and prevent discrimination at every level of customer interaction. "These numbers are looking good," Layla Washington remarked, sliding into the chair across from Marcus's desk. Now Horizon's Chief Diversity Officer Layla had been instrumental in developing and implementing the protocol, but I'm even more impressed by the qualitative feedback. People are sharing their stories about how differently they're being treated when they fly now. Marcus nodded, scrolling through testimonials from passengers of color who reported feeling genuinely welcome in first-class cabins for the first time. It's progress. But we still have work to do. The transformation hadn't come easily. In the immediate aftermath of the Flight 492 incident, there had been resistance from every corner of the airline industry. Executives complained about implementation costs, unions worried about unfair discipline for employees, and conservative pundits accused Marcus of leveraging woke capitalism to advance a personal agenda. But Marcus had held firm, wielding the twin powers of public opinion and technological leverage. The viral video of his confrontation with Olivia Bennett had garnered over 50 million views, sparking a nationwide conversation about the everyday discrimination faced by people of color in supposedly elite spaces. More importantly, Horizon's control of reservation systems used by 70% of North American airlines gave him the ability to make anti-discrimination measures a condition of continuing to use their software. The Wall Street Journal piece came out this morning, Layla said, sliding her tablet across the desk. They're calling it the Reynolds Revolution. The article detailed how the changes that had begun in the airline industry were now spreading across hospitality, retail, and other customer service sectors. Companies were discovering that addressing discrimination wasn't just ethically right, but good for business. Customer satisfaction scores were up, employee retention had improved, and the companies implementing the most aggressive anti-bias measures were seeing their stock prices outperform competitors. Have you seen the latest from Mia Zhang? Layla asked, referring to the college student whose live stream had helped catapult the initial incident into the national spotlight. Mia had parlayed her viral moment into a successful career as a civil rights documentarian. Her production company, TruthStream Media, had produced a powerful series called Seat at the Table that followed ordinary people of color as they navigated spaces where they were traditionally unwelcome or underrepresented. Her team reached out yesterday, Marcus replied. They want to do a follow-up piece on the 2-year anniversary of Flight 492. I told them I'd think about it. The truth was, Marcus had mixed feelings about revisiting that day. While he was proud of the changes he'd helped create, he was wary of being reduced to a single moment in time, the angry black CEO who grounded his own airline. His work was about so much more than that now. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Jordan, stepped in. Mr. Reynolds, your 10 o'clock is here. The delegation from the Department of Transportation. Marcus exchanged a glance with Layla, who gave him an encouraging nod. This meeting could represent the next phase of their work. Federal regulations that would codify many of the anti-discrimination measures they'd pioneered in the private sector. Send them in, Marcus said, standing to greet his visitors. The delegation was led by Secretary of Transportation Gabriela Reyes, a formidable woman in her late 50s, whose own rise through the ranks of transportation policy had been marked by the kind of barriers that Marcus was now working to dismantle. Mr. Reynolds, Secretary Reyes said, shaking his hand firmly, thank you for making time for us today. What you've accomplished in the private sector is remarkable, but we believe it's time to ensure that these protections extend to every passenger on every airline, regardless of which software systems they use. As they settled around the conference table, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on how far things had come. 2 years ago, he had been standing in the aisle of Flight 492, being told that he didn't belong in first class. Now he was helping shape federal policy to prevent others from experiencing the same treatment. We've drafted preliminary regulations based largely on your Reynolds protocol, Secretary Reyes continued, distributing tablets with the proposal. Mandatory bias training for all customer-facing personnel, standardized reporting procedures for discrimination complaints, and penalties for airlines that fail to address systemic issues. Marcus scanned the document, noting with satisfaction that many of the technological innovations his team had developed were being incorporated into the proposed regulations. This is a strong start, he said, but there's one critical element missing. The secretary raised an eyebrow. What's that? Accountability at the leadership level, Marcus replied. In my experience, discrimination persists because the people at the top don't face consequences when it happens. We need metrics that tie executive compensation to diversity and inclusion outcomes, Secretary Reyes smiled. That's precisely why we wanted to meet with you, Mr. Reynolds. We need someone who understands both the technology and the human elements of this issue. Would you be willing to serve on a presidential commission to help finalize these regulations? Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was from an app his team had developed that tracked discrimination incidents in real time across partner airlines. The alert showed a situation developing on an Atlantic Airlines flight in Dallas. A passenger of color being questioned about their first-class ticket, despite having proper documentation. Excuse me for one moment, Marcus said, tapping on his phone to pull up more details. He watched as the airline's system flagged the incident and automatically escalated it to management. Within seconds, a supervisor was dispatched to the gate, and the situation was resolved with an apology to the passenger and a note for additional training for the gate agent. The entire process had taken less than 2 minutes, a far cry from the days when such incidents would have been dismissed, ignored, or buried in paperwork. This was the power of technology when applied to social justice: immediate intervention, consistent application of policies, and data collection that allowed for ongoing improvement. "That's exactly what we're talking about," Secretary Reyes said, having observed the alert. "Systematic response rather than case-by-case rationalization." Marcus nodded, pocketing his phone. "To answer your question, Secretary Reyes, yes, I would be honored to serve on the commission. But I want to ensure that we're not just creating regulations. We're creating a new standard for how companies think about discrimination." As the meeting continued, Marcus's thoughts drifted to a conversation he'd had with Carmen Diaz, the Chicago Tribune journalist who had witnessed the original incident. She had asked him a question that had stuck with him. What happens when the next Marcus Reynolds, someone who doesn't own an airline, faces discrimination? That question had guided much of his work over the past 2 years. The Reynolds Protocol wasn't just about protecting people with power. It was about extending that protection to everyone, especially those who couldn't ground a flight with the tap of a phone screen. After the Department of Transportation delegation departed, promising to send formal appointment papers for the commission, Marcus found himself drawn to the window overlooking the Chicago skyline. In the distance, he could see O'Hare International Airport, planes taking off and landing in a carefully choreographed dance. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Layla asked, joining him at the window. "I was thinking about Captain Morgan and Rachel Miller," Marcus replied. The flight crew from that fateful day had become an unexpected part of the story. After their initial suspensions, Marcus had made a controversial decision. Rather than firing them, he had offered them the opportunity to become part of the solution. Captain Morgan now led Atlantic's anti-bias training program, drawing on his own mistakes to help other crew members recognize and address discrimination. Rachel Miller had taken a position with Horizon's software development team, providing frontline perspective on how reservation and passenger management systems could better prevent bias incidents. They were products of a system, Marcus continued, a system that trained them to prioritize the comfort of certain passengers over the rights of others. Changing the people without changing the system wouldn't have solved anything. Layla nodded in agreement. "And Olivia Bennett? Have you heard anything about her?" Marcus hadn't spoken publicly about what had happened with the woman who had refused to give up his seat. After her permanent ban from Atlantic Airlines, Olivia Bennett had initially threatened legal action, claiming she had been unfairly portrayed. But faced with overwhelming video evidence and public backlash, she had eventually retreated from public view. 6 months after the incident, Marcus had received a handwritten letter from her. It wasn't exactly an apology, more of a reflection on how the experience had forced her to confront assumptions she hadn't realized she held. She had written about attending implicit bias workshops and reading books about the Black experience in America. The letter had ended with a request. Would Marcus be willing to meet with her, not for publicity or forgiveness, but for understanding? "I did meet with her," Marcus admitted, something he hadn't shared with many people. "Last year, we had coffee at a small place in Boston where nobody recognized us." "And?" Layla prompted. "And it was complicated. She's not a cartoon villain. She's someone who spent her entire life in spaces where her privilege went unquestioned and unchallenged. When that bubble burst, it was genuinely disorienting for her." The conversation had been difficult, awkward at times, but ultimately productive. Marcus hadn't absolved Olivia of responsibility for her actions, but he had acknowledged the broader context that had shaped her worldview. In turn, she had listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time, to what it meant to navigate spaces that weren't designed with you in mind. "She's working with a diversity and inclusion nonprofit now," Marcus added, "teaching wealthy white women about privilege and allyship. It's not earth-shattering, but it's something." Their conversation was interrupted by Jordan, who appeared at the door again. "Mr. Reynolds, they're ready for you in the studio." Marcus nodded, straightening his tie. Today marked another milestone in the ongoing work, the launch of a nationwide public awareness campaign about travel discrimination. The campaign featured stories from travelers of all backgrounds who had faced bias, alongside practical information about how to report incidents and what protections were available. As Marcus made his way to the in-house studio, he passed the wall of memorabilia that had accumulated over the past 2 years. Framed news articles about the Flight 492 incident, awards for Horizon's anti-discrimination technology, and photographs of Marcus with civil rights leaders, politicians, and ordinary travelers who had benefited from the changes he'd initiated. But his favorite item was a simple framed boarding pass, his ticket for seat 3A on Atlantic Airlines Flight 492. He had kept it as a reminder that sometimes the most important journeys weren't about destinations, but about the stands you took along the way. In the studio, a production team was setting up for a live stream that would be broadcast across multiple platforms. The campaign was being launched in partnership with TruthStream Media, with Mia Zhang serving as moderator for a panel discussion featuring Marcus, Secretary Reyes, and several individuals who had experienced discrimination while traveling. "We're live in 5 minutes, Mr. Reynolds," the producer announced as a makeup artist made final touch-ups. Marcus took his seat on the panel, exchanging greetings with the other participants. Among them was Dr. James Wilson, the older black man who had been sitting in row 5 during the original incident. Dr. Wilson, a retired surgeon, had reached out to Marcus afterward to share his own stories of being questioned and disrespected in first-class cabins throughout his career. "It's good to see you again, son," Dr. Wilson said warmly, clasping Marcus's hand. "Who would have thought that your stand that day would lead to all this?" Marcus smiled. "Certainly not me. I just wanted to sit in my seat." "Sometimes that's all it takes," Dr. Wilson replied. "Just refusing to move when someone tells you that you don't belong." The lights dimmed and Mia Zhang stepped onto the set, her presence confident and assured, a far cry from the nervous college student who had tentatively filmed the confrontation 2 years earlier. "Good morning, everyone," Mia began, looking directly into the camera. 2 years ago today, a black CEO named Marcus Reynolds boarded a flight and was told he didn't belong in first class. What happened next sparked a revolution in how we think about discrimination in travel and beyond. Today, we're launching a nationwide campaign to ensure that every traveler knows their rights and that every company understands their responsibilities. As the panel discussion unfolded, Marcus found himself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had brought him here. The incident on Flight 492 had been painful, humiliating, and infuriating. But it had also been clarifying. It had shown him exactly where his power and responsibility intersected, not just as a CEO, but as someone who had the capacity to create change that would benefit others, who shared his experiences, but not his privileges. "Mr. Reynolds," Mia said, turning to him during the discussion. "Many people watching may be wondering, what can they do if they experience discrimination but don't have the power to ground an airplane?" It was a question Marcus had anticipated, one that got to the heart of his work over the past 2 years. "The truth is, most people can't respond the way I did that day. They don't own airlines or control reservation systems. That's precisely why systematic changes are so important, because justice shouldn't depend on having extraordinary power." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What everyone can do is document what happens to them, report it through official channels, which now have real teeth thanks to our new systems, and share their experiences when they feel safe doing so. The power of these stories, collectively told and heard, is what drives institutional change." As the panel continued, questions poured in from viewers around the world. People shared their own experiences of discrimination, not just in air travel, but in hotels, restaurants, retail stores, and other public spaces. Each story reinforced what Marcus had come to understand. His experience on Flight 492 hadn't been exceptional. What had been exceptional was his ability to do something about it. After the live stream concluded, Marcus stepped outside the studio to find Layla waiting with news. "The DOT regulations just cleared their first committee vote," she reported. "And 3 more major airlines have signed on to the voluntary standards ahead of the mandatory implementation." "That's progress," Marcus acknowledged, "but there's still so much work to do." His phone buzzed with another alert from the discrimination tracking system. This time, it wasn't reporting an incident but highlighting a success story. A flight attendant who had intervened when a first-class passenger had questioned whether another passenger belonged in the cabin. The system had flagged the intervention for positive reinforcement, part of a feedback loop designed to reward employees who upheld the new standards. Marcus smiled as he read the details. This was how change happened, not just through policies and technologies, but through shifting. The everyday interactions that made up people's lived experiences. Every time a flight attendant stood up for a passenger's dignity, every time a gate agent recognized and countered their own biases, the world became a little more just. Later that afternoon, Marcus found himself back in his office, preparing for a board meeting where he would present the next phase of Horizon's anti-discrimination initiative, an expansion beyond travel into healthcare, education, and financial services. The work was nowhere near complete, but the path forward was clearer now than it had been 2 years ago. A knock at his door revealed Jordan with an unexpected delivery, a small package with no return address. Curious, Marcus opened it to find a framed photograph of seat 3A on an Atlantic Airlines plane, along with a handwritten note. "Thank you for not moving. Because you stood your ground, many of us can now sit wherever we belong. A grateful passenger." Marcus placed the frame on his desk next to his boarding pass from Flight 492. The juxtaposition of these two items, one representing the problem, the other the progress, captured something essential about the journey he had undertaken. His phone rang, displaying Layla's number. "You're going to want to see this," she said without preamble. "Turn on CNN." Marcus switched on the office television to see breaking news. A major hotel chain had just announced the adoption of anti-discrimination measures modeled on the Reynolds Protocol. Their CEO was speaking at a press conference, explicitly crediting Marcus's work in the airline industry as the inspiration. "It's spreading," Layla said, her voice filled with quiet satisfaction. "Beyond airlines, beyond travel. The standard, you said, is becoming the norm." Marcus watched as other business leaders joined the hotel's CEO on stage, each announcing their own commitments to implementing similar measures. What had begun as one man's refusal to give up his seat was blossoming into a movement that crossed industry boundaries. As he prepared for the board meeting, Marcus thought about how far they had come, and how far they still had to go. The work of creating truly inclusive spaces, places where everyone was treated with dignity regardless of how they looked or what they wore, was ongoing. But for the first time, it felt like the systems and structures that enabled discrimination were being challenged, not just by activists and advocates, but by the power of corporate America itself. In the end, the story that had begun on Atlantic Airlines Flight 492 wasn't really about Marcus Reynolds at all. It was about what happened when someone with power refused to accept injustice and chose instead to use that power to create change. It was about the ripple effects that spread outward from that choice, touching lives in ways that even Marcus himself couldn't have anticipated. As he gathered his materials for the board meeting, Marcus paused to look once more at the photograph of seat 3A and the simple note that accompanied it. In that moment, he was reminded of something his grandmother had often told him. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to move when someone tells you that you don't belong. That day on Flight 492, Marcus Reynolds had done exactly that. And in doing so, he had started a journey that was helping to ensure that many others would never have to fight for their rightful seat again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.